Okay, what's up, y'all? I got another Tearout tutorial for you today, and I think it's a pretty good one. I've done a good couple Tearout tutorials where it's me showing you how to make a gun bass, and then we just kind of try and make it flow through the track, do a couple things arrangement-wise to make it interesting. This one I wanted to do a bunch of different elements that work together really well, and I think that that's one of the things that can separate, like, kind of beginner or intermediate sounding Tearout that's like interesting or cool but not that unique from something that's more advanced or higher level. I think just, you know, putting different elements together is what separates a really cool Tearout track from something that just kind of doesn't stand out from the crowd. So with that, I'll go ahead and play it so you know what you're getting into, and we'll go ahead and get started.
This is white trash at its finest.
And we're going to be covering quite a bit of stuff in this tutorial. I'm going to go through the sound design, I'm going to do arrangement and some arrangement tips, then we're going to do some tension and effects filler tips, and then also mixing and mastering. It shouldn't take that long, but I will be going through quickly in some of these parts because I think a lot of y'all have a good idea of how to produce already without me showing too much. And I think this one's another good example of a bunch of different not so great on their own sounds coming together to make a pretty decent final product. So here's our individual sounds. We have the gritty hit, the airy hit, this little bright hit, the sub, and then the sub with the noise layer. And so we'll go ahead and get into the sound design first. And I really struggled making this project because in the beginning I was trying to sound design and arrange at the same time. So make the patches and then play the notes in the patches. And I just couldn't really get it to work at all. So what I ended up doing is making each of the different sounds, bouncing them to audio, and then working with the audio, which is a really good way to like separate your sound design portion of the track from your arrangement and like performance, as it were, portion of the track. It just keeps you from like bouncing back and forth from like, hey, I'm making this patch to, hey, I'm making this song. Okay, so I'm going to be running through the sound design really quickly, and that's just because I don't think any of these sounds are doing any of the sound design is what makes this project good. It's more arrangement and mixing. So let's see if I can get through this really quick. LFO1 on this first, the purple patch that we had, the gritty sound without any processing sounds like that. It's not good at all. LFO1 is kind of doing our volume gating, just getting a little hit going there. It's on Tigra, pitch down 2 octaves. LFO2 scans through our wavetable position, just giving us a lot of noise going on there. So then we have our filter. It's just kind of sweeping a high pass filter with a good bit of resonance, drive all the way up, mix all the way up. And as you can see, it's just kind of pulling that high pass with the resonance down and the notch a little bit below it. If I slow down the LFO1, you can see it's just pulling those low mid frequencies and making a little hit sound. Then we have a flanger. I'm not going to talk too much about these. Flanger with 50%. I did change the settings so you can copy the settings exactly if you want to. Then we have a diode 1 distortion with the drive being gated by our volume automation. So that just gives it some dirtiness. Then we're going in, distorting it with a fruity fast distortion. An OTT, kind of just slamming it. Then we have a delay 3. I'll talk about this one for a little bit because it's turning it into a rhythm sound all of a sudden. And the way that we do that is we have our time set to 26.8 milliseconds. The stereo delay is on from mono, right? So we turn that on. Then the offset's on, which does a little Haas delay. I think with each delay, there's a little bit more left-right offset that happens. I've changed my feedback from being filtered to being off, so it's just fully delayed signal, no filter added to that. Then the dryness is mostly off, which doesn't really do too much except for get rid of that initial first hit and let it be almost all delay signal. Then I'm doing some EQing here. I'm not going to talk about that. You can see Just boost the mid, boost the high, cut the low range out. Frequency shifter set to ring modulation mode. I'm sorry I'm going really quick, but it's just, this is going to be so long of a tutorial if I don't. It's set to ring mod mode, 20 kilohertz, so I've changed the range. That just almost makes it a little growlier in a way. You can copy the settings there if you want to. Then we have this wave shaper that these curves, if you go like a really sharply, I think it's a logarithmic curve or maybe the opposite, an exponential curve. I don't know what the name of the curve is, but you can see what it looks like. That gives it like a bit crushy feel. Then we're going to keep it moving. This EQ right here is boosting that low mid frequency, right? Giving it kind of a resonance there, which just makes it a little bit more of a hit and less of a growl. Then we have a compressor just kind of, it's cutting a little bit. It's increasing the transient by cutting that tail down, which makes it, again, a little bit more of a gun sound. And we're going to keep it breezing and moving here. Then we have our airy layer, which this one actually sounds nothing like what it ends up being. This is this one. And it started out real different from that. So I have, again, a volume triggered kind of gun shape here. The ICANN has kick wavetable is what I'm using. Oops, let me turn this to envelope mode. And as you can see, it's just scanning through those different, going from like a lot of higher fundamental frequencies being represented to just low. Then we have LFO2, which controls that sweep there. That's without the filter. Then we put the filter on. It's got 50% drive. LFO2, again, controlling our filter cutoff. Just kind of scanning through that low mid band, drives at 50, a little bit of resonance, mix all the way on. Then we have a sine shaper, just distorting it a little bit. Then we have our low pass filter, which in hindsight, I actually went through and like turned this off and on. It sounds better without this. I will just show the rest of it with that on though, but you don't need to do that. Then we have an OTT that's time all the way up, gain staged a little bit. Then a EQ here, as you can see, cutting the lows, the low mids, boosting the highs a little bit, then distorting it. You can copy those settings if you want to. Then we have our first bit of stereo imaging, giving it some stereo image. Then we have another wave shaper, using that same bit crushy type technique with a pretty strong band. I gain staged here too. As you can see, the post gain is pulled down. So then we have a convolver, and as you can see, I pulled the dry down a little bit, turned the wetness up a little bit. And then I also went in here and faded out the default convolution source. I did a bunch of fade outs on it, which just makes it way shorter. Then we go in, boost the highs a good amount, like the mid high. Oh, it's actually the highs, and then boosted the really highs a good bit and cut the lows out again. So then we have another reverb, just giving it a little bit more of like a space that makes it sound like a brass stab, which is not what I was going for, but I think it worked well in the final product. Then going into our next patch, it's the bright little stab that happens in the background or in the foreground. It's kind of mixed pretty high up there in the final project. This one's probably the best patch in this sound design session, so I'll spend a little bit more time talking about it. Even though they're all sounds that I think are worth knowing how to make for sure. And this one's really loud, so just prepare your ears. We go ahead and turn off all the effects and the filter. There we go. That gets it a little more listenable too. So we have here, LFO1 is controlling our level on oscillator A, which is the default saw, oscillator B, also the default saw, FMing from B with LFO1, modulating it. And then we have oscillator A is down 2 octaves, oscillator B is down 4 octaves. Then LFO2 here, I'll turn on my oscillator B. This is our FM source. And as you can see, LFO2 is scanning through the octaves going from high to low, and it's set to it's not set to BPM sync, it's set to Hertz sync, which just lets you be a lot more granular with the speed that cuts through there. I'll turn that back off. And then we have our filter, which again just is a band notch that makes a nice little thunk out of it. We got our low band is going up and meeting our notch that's going down. Drives at 50%. And LFO3 is controlling that right there. So then we'll go into our effects here. I'll go one at a time. It's going to start getting louder and louder. I didn't gain stage this till later in the effects chain. So we have a flange filter with the cutoff being modulated by the same thing that controls, so LFO2 that controls the octave drop is going up on the cutoff of the flange filter. The resonance is being gated by our volume LFO1. Then we have 50% drive and some panning and 50% mix. And that panning just gives you some interesting stereo. And the EQ, this is going to make it really loud, so just prepare your ears. And we have a low boost that is being modulated by our same LFO that controlled the filters. Yeah, this left band is going from high to higher, and the low band, which is the really heavily boosted one, is going from low to high. Just really slamming the volume there. Again, distortion is going to get loud still, so be ready. And that one's being gated by our volume LFO set to asymmetrical. We got our 70% wetness there. Then an OTT just making it, again, way more slammed. Now, before we move on, as you might have noticed in the project here, that's what that turns into, but it does change to that for the second half. And it's controlled by this macro here. And all that this macro does, if I turn on my oscillator B again, whoops, let me turn these filters back off, is it raises the octave that oscillator B defaults to at the end of this curve, right? It sounds like a 2-octave jump there. And I'll turn this back off. And that's going to be it for this patch, y'all. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's not going to be it. Then we go into our post effects, which is an EQ cutting the lows out, a convolver. And this one is just making it a lot more ringy, a little bit more metallic. If you don't have that, you can probably get this done with some kind of resonator plug-in. Then we have this fruity convolver, which gives it that really nice, like sharp, dissonant stabbiness that almost like when in like a Michael Myers film, when he's like running behind him with the knife and he's like, ding, ding, ding. It's really dissonant. It's kind of nerve-wracking, but it works great for Tearout, any more dark, heavy version of dubstep. And all that I did here was put a clap sample that I made into there and stretched it up a little bit. This just turns the pitch of this up. It like resamples it up a little bit. And then the wetness is turned up quite a bit and the dry is turned down. Then going into our next EQ, which as you can see, I pulled the output level down by negative 26 decibels here. So gain staging this is the point where I started gain staging this sound. And then just cutting the lows. I didn't do too much but gain stage there. And then this is making it a little louder. Let me pull in my oscilloscope so you can see what this is doing pretty clearly. This is not that important of a step, but so that is with our compressor on. Then so compressor on. I'm sorry, compressor off. Then when we turn it on, it just gets a little bit louder, but without getting the peak too much higher. It's probably not that necessary of a thing to show, but there we go. It's been shown. Then we have a wave shaper. And that's boosting the gain quite a bit and distorting it just a little. It's not really even distorting it too much, just boosting the gain. Oh, and I think there's more gain staging there too. So it's boost. Yeah, no, not at all. Then we have another EQ. And that's boosting those high frequencies just a bit. And as you can see here, it's making both variations of the sound. quite a bit sharper. And that's going to be it for that patch. And just know that when I rendered these, this is the only one that I rendered 2 versions of. I rendered one with the macro off and I rendered one with the macro on. Now moving into our sub, which is by far our simplest sound, as it usually is, at least in the sound design only portion. I did do a lot of effects to the sub. So we have a saw wave, a square wave, pitched down an octave, and oscillator B is also pitched down an octave and it's set to a sine wave. And both are just being turned up really fast at this 1/2 rate. It's a lot more sine wave than it is square, which, you know, you can do a lot of different things to make subs beefier. This one I just chose mostly sine and a little bit of square to add some more harmonics. Then we have a pitch drop going on here, which if I turn my filter off, it's pushing the I've shown this 1,000 times, but I have to keep showing it in case this is somebody's first time watching one of my videos. LFO2 is routed to the master tuning. Unipolar mode is set on, and it goes up 7 units. Not cents. That's just the units that Serum works in. And it's set to envelope mode, same as this first LFO. I think almost all the LFOs I just showed were set to envelope mode or trigger mode, but it doesn't ever reset. It doesn't ever get to the end of it. So then we have a low filter with just 240 hertz cutoff. Then we have a wave shaper, slamming the signal out, adding a bunch more harmonics. That's just distorting it a lot. Then we have a EQ here, just cutting out those high frequencies that I didn't want to be in the final result of the sub. And for the sub, that was it. All right, so before we move into the arrangement section, I will just show the drums really quick. Utterly simple. So we have our kick snare on the standard rhythm pattern. I do have 2 different side chains here. So we have the kick side chain, which triggers a MIDI out, which MIDI out is a little clip like this. This one is set to port 0. That goes into the input port 0 in this. And as you can see, anytime that little clip plays, it triggers the side chain. Then our snare side chain, whoops, does the snare. And as you can see, they're slightly different in their shape, and it's just to kind of cater to, I mean, they look almost identical, but they are a little bit, you know, the kick has a little bit more space to the bottom, the snare pulls up a little quicker. You know, it's just to have each volume shaper carve out the exact shape of this and the exact shape of this. And so we'll keep it moving from there. Okay, so going into the arrangement here, I'm going to show how these 4 elements that I just created work together, and there's more post-processing on them that I did in the mixing phase that makes them sound quite a bit different, so just know we'll get to that later. So in this first half here, we have basically the gritty and the sub work together here. So we have every time the gritty hit happens, the sub happens. And as you can see here, sometimes the sub will extend out quite a bit further, and then sometimes it'll stop short. And that is to help this little interaction that we have going with the brightness. And as you can see, the spacing that we have on this is, if I set it to a half step, there's a little delay between the kick, where the kick hits, and the first grittiness happens, and that's to give space for the side chain. Helps the transient start past that. And then the first bright hit happens at that same point, and then the bright hit is not synced up with the gritty hit, right? It's not happening when the gritty happens. It's its own unique, distinct rhythmic element. So I'll play these together just to show. As you can see, the sub extends out to go with the bright hit here, but then when the bright shortens and allows this little glitch piece to come in, the sub stops, and that gives space. And since there's no sub frequencies in this part, it gives a lot more weight to that next initial hit of the sub and everything coming back in on that snare. Keeping it moving, I will just show that, because this one doesn't change much, the airy layer is just really, a backing layer, not even to these synth parts, but to the drums, right? And when you're doing Tearout, you can get some really good, I would say, like effective results by having an element that remains the same through the whole drop, fills up space, and also just, you know, gives a contrast to what all your different synths. Right, it's filling that out. It's making it. It's giving this whole drop like a space to be in a way, without just putting reverb on them. Right, without just doing the standard reverb trick type thing. But we'll leave that off for most of this explanation. So then we have our bright. As you can see, the spacing on this is every 1, 2, 3 half steps, another bright happens, and the only switches that we have are, is it going to be 5 repetitions, is it going to be 4 repetitions, or is it going to be 3 repetitions, and that stays standard for this whole track, for this whole clip here, this whole little 32 bar clip. Then as you can see, as we get to this very last bar here, there's some changes that happen that I think I'll go over a little bit later once we get to the tension effects section. Then we have a switch here, and in this second half, our sub interacts with our gritty again, but it also interacts with this little bright hit. So I'm going to play the sub and the gritty. Let's go ahead and compare it here to what we have in the first half. Right, so one hits and the other one hits at the same time, and then here we have... there's this like skippy little last hit that starts where our final bright hit, that's a variation, happens. So the bright changes, right? The bright goes from the dark version to the a little bit more high pitched version. And then there's this last hit that's like a almost digital sounding variation of it. And so the way that I got this little last hit to sound different is I turned ring modulation on, changed the frequency here. So, right, just kind of got a unique tone on that. And then I use this EQ balance thing to make it brighter. So there's a type of EQ called a tilt EQ. And just imagine like you have your band here. Let me just do this in a Pro Q3. So if you have a tilt filter on something, or a tilt band, let's go in here and show what that looks like, flat tilt. You can turn it up, and that's turning all of the lows down and all the highs up, or you can turn it the opposite way, which is turning all the lows up and all the highs down. It just changes the brightness of it, right? So it's either way darker or way brighter. And I just did that to kind of EQ match this. Because as you can see, without that, it's just not quite as sharp in the mix. So here we have this final sub hit landing where that last variation piece on the bright synth section is. And it's just really, you know, since Tearout is not a lot of different notes, it's not a lot of different melodies, it's all... I think more of an art of trying to get different rhythms to sound interesting together with a very small variation in notes, because again, you have some pitch variation in Tearout, but not as much as like a symphony orchestra where it's only pitch variation and volume changes. So that's how those interact there. And the next thing that we have here that's making this quite a bit more interesting is we have this sub, grit, and bright 2 pitch envelope. It's an automation that controls the pitch of just the sub, the gritty patch, and the second bright patch. And if you look at the curves here, once again, it's flat and then goes up into that first snare. and up into the first snare, down into the second snare, up into the third, down into the fourth. And then for this last piece, as you can see, it takes the sub and the gritty patch just down, but it doesn't affect this first half of the bright. And I don't know why I did that, but it makes sense to my ears at this point, so I'm not gonna change it. It's gonna mess with my how this track sounds. Oh, you know what? I think the reason that I did it, no, I don't know why I did it, but I mean, it could very well probably work this way too. Oh, you know why I didn't do this? Because I think it was messing with my ears too much. Yeah, I didn't like this first piece also following the pitch. I kind of just liked it as its own separate element, even though it does follow it in the second half of the drop for this second. Yeah, actually, it's funny because the reason why it doesn't bug me as much here is because it's not changing that much. It's just barely affecting this one here, and then it skips here, so it's barely affecting it. Yeah. And then the last thing that I'll say before I move on is these are all in resample mode. So the gritty, everything but the sub is in resample mode, which means, as you can see here, it changes the length of these samples, which for the sub, I wanted it to stay the same length always, so there wasn't this issue with it really comes into play more here with the length of it getting longer and the notes running into each other, which doesn't sound like too much of an issue, but at the time, oh no, yeah, see, it cuts out the transients, right? Because these sub layers are running into each other in resample mode. It makes those transients a lot weaker. Yeah, you can. I hope you have the deep enough speakers to hear that, but it's basically cutting the transients out because the tail of this is running into the attack of the next one. Okay, so we're going to go into our tension effects now, some of those little fillers and tricks that I did to make this just a better overall track, I think. So first we have our rest before the snares that happen. So we only get 4 bright hits here, 4 bright hits here, and then 3 there, and that's to give space for this little glitchy piece, and also just to let the volume and everything kind of cut out a bit before that snare hits. Then the sub comes back in, it just makes it more impactful, a little more heavy. Then I have this little reverb sweep, which is the gritty patch. It goes into this fruity convolver, and for this, I just loaded in a little Tearout sample that I had. I turned the dryness all the way down, and then as you can see, like if I turn this on, and so it uses this little automation envelope to just sweep into the snare and then cut off really quick. Again, using that little Tearout sample that I had in my library. So that creates that. I'll turn this back off. Then our next little fill here is a sample from a session that I made of just some pretty harsh, not too musical, glitchy sounding stuff that I turned the time mode, I turned the stretch mode to stretch pro, left the formants at the original pitch there, and then did a channel pitch change that just kind of, if I solo it out, you can see just slides down. So it takes this and turns it into this. And then with stretch mode being on, same thing as the sub, it doesn't change the length of it. It keeps it that certain length. So we have 2 subs, a good bit of rest here, giving some more strength to that second snare that comes in the second 4 bars. Then we have the same reverb again, and the same little glitch going into our halfway point. So at the halfway, it's a lot of times a good time to do a significant switch up in your patterns and leading into that with something like a pitch drop or reverb swell or like some kind of repetition, you know, the whole like, you know, something that just lets you know a change is coming. A change, I think really like the beginner thing to do is just add a, you know, a noise sweep and some reverb, or maybe cut the low frequencies out or something like that. A thing that I think makes a cooler track to me at least is change the pattern, but keep it the same enough that it just lets the listener know we're about to switch up without just keeping the same exact pattern going. So we have this pitch drop goes pretty far down here. And then this reverb sweep comes in pretty heavily. It also goes past, you know, we skip our snare here. We skip our next kick. So our next half of this song is starting at this point right here. Right? So we're really drifting down, reverb up. The reverb kills right before this happens. And then we have the sub volume drops out on this last hit, which gives space for this next sub to be nice and loud. And I'll explain what the brown sub is in a second. And I'll just show really quickly that this send reverb is just the gritty, the airy, and the bright all sent into another convolver using this source, which is in the library. It's this factory. It's this one, the Lex Chamber Hall Bright Reflex. So I think that's it. Yeah, Hall. And then I put a limiter on it, and I think with anything that you're doing a reverb to, adding a limiter just to compress it so that once it gets loud, it doesn't get overly loud. This is bringing up the volume. And then also it's giving a ceiling to the volume. So like pushing it to where once it gets to this point, stop letting it get so loud. And then I'm also boosting the gain on it. Right, so it just makes it nice and powerful. It lets the reverb fill it up. You know, we're trying to fill the space up so it feels like we're getting a change in energy here. I'm sorry this is turning into quite a long one, but, you know, there's a lot to go over. I spent too long making this. So then we have this sub, the brown sub, which all that it is... Oh, I have to change the pitch on it. Is a reversed sub... Whoops. Where that pitch drop is at the end instead of the beginning, and it's a pitch rise. So, right, it's reversed. So instead of it dropping and then going into the tone, it's at the tone and then it goes up versus, you know, the opposite. And so as you can see here, I've dragged the end of the sample from, you know, we have our drop at this side of it here. So now our drop is at the other side. Like if you look, this is really long. I rendered it really long. That way I could have a lot of different space for it. And then here, the length is at the beginning, and I've chopped it down to fit right in here. And what that does, if I bring my little vector scope down, I also have a really quick channel pitch rise on this. Let me, I guess I'll have to have that on. So it just shows instead of pitch dropping, going down, the automation brings that sub pitch down the whole time. This one is really quickly rising. And I think I got this idea. I was referring to a Bunda track. It was the trucker dub from Bunda, and he does some really cool stuff with his subs in that one. And I was, you know, wanting to get something similar to that, or something that, you know, brought the same type of energy that did. And so for this, I've just brought the sub pitch up really quickly. If I pitch it up an octave, you can even tell more, right? A lot of your sub frequencies are gonna, in a large show setting or in a club or whatever, it's usually a sine wave, and it gives a lot more movement. Like high end stuff, at a certain point, it all kind of sounds the same, like mid, low, mid, highs. It doesn't all sound the same, but like it's always gonna be the same energy. So if you bring in a lot of sub pitch movement, it helps to like make this is such a hard thing to explain, but it's just, it brings a different kind of energy than just changing the high end would, right? Changing your mids and highs. I don't know if I'm over explaining that, but that's what I got. So then I have the gritty variation here, which this is the OG. I'm gonna have to go to a different section of the automation so it's not always pitching everything down. So we have our gritty, original, then our adjusted, which I did the same trick that I used on the bright variation that I had, which is I pitched it down using resampling. So resampled it down and then used ring modulation and just kind of changed the ring modulation frequency to give it that like almost little yonky growl sound. And I also have some other effects on that I'll show later. So we have our sub reverse happens with that yonky little growl, and then a little laser zap to make it seem like we have, you know, our variation hit happens, and then that zap is like all the frequencies from that hit got stopped and pulled down, almost like a tape stop. It's almost like a tape stop pullback, but without having to do that. And you can get some really good results from like putting any kind of a laser zap effects to be the like sudden ending of some sounds that you have going. So then here again, we have the sub comes and changes, which I've already talked about, but I do switch from, you know, this 4 pattern to the same 4 pattern, but with this reverse sub again, where our end of it is right at the end here. So it's doing that pitch rise right there. With another little glitch sample layered on top of that, which is just another Tearout sample I had. And it's getting slammed out with some effects, and it just gives a little crunchy, almost swing to this part. Right? It's almost like a little sneezy, snatchy, pulley, grabby sounding type thing. I don't know how to explain it, but that's what it sounds like to me. Then we use the same memory conduit is what I had, the name of that sample is, with a different curve here that gets ended again by that zap sample. So it's almost like zip, you know, very snatchy, grabby, swung type deal going on there. And then our last major thing, because the end of this is really just a repetition of the beginning, except for the bright 2 sample. Changes pitch on that one. So for this, that's the same as this first half, just with a couple different sounds in the palette. Then this, we have a third variation of the gritty, which is just one that I've gated the length of, right? I've pulled the length to be the same length as the little bright synth. And it's pretty self-explanatory there. We just have a pitch rise that affects the sub. Also, the sub stops doing repetitive hits. And again, I keep going too far. All right, and then our reverb comes back in here. I think I can solo that out. And then cuts out again. So pretty simple stuff, or not pretty simple, but like pretty none of these things that I've done are like completely, you know, this is not the most unique thing ever, but by putting together a lot of different techniques in the arrangement, we've basically taken 3 shitty sounds, nothing unique about these drums, right? Very cookie cutter drums. The pitch changing thing here is not unique either. Nothing about this is groundbreaking. The sound design is trash. A lot of this is very easy to do and not on its own sounding good stuff. But like, if you know that these are things that you can put together, these are all tools that you can use to make your Tearout way cooler. Because now if you have a good sound design session, you can take that and use these same tricks on it. So I think this is the arrangement and little glitchy fill parts. Those are the big tricks from this tutorial, even though, everybody always thinks like, oh, if you just have good enough sound design, that's what makes you a great dubstep producer. And it's like, no, you need to have some of the conceptual like understanding of why does Murata's stuff sound so badass? And like, why does, I mean, you know, Bunda is, I think he gets a fair amount of recognition, but like, why is somebody like Bunda's terrible? I feel like I'm hating on his stuff, but like his sound design is not very insane, I would say, but he's so good at the like understanding what to do with it that his tracks are fire. So I will just say I love Bunda. But I just started listening to his shit very recently. But like, I think he's a good example of somebody who's like doing a lot with a little in the best way possible. I'd highly recommend. I hope that didn't sound like I'm like shitting on him. But like a lot of that stuff is a lot of those techniques are what makes the stuff cool. It's not always just make a better sound design and you're a better artist. You got to know how to use it. So from there, I'm sorry for that long tangent, but we'll go ahead and jump into the polishing, the mixing section of this. So for this, I am going to turn off my mastering chain, which as you can see, really takes a lot of energy out of this track. And we'll go ahead and start soloing out some of these. I'll turn these back off so I don't get confused. And we'll start going into some of the individual processing on these sounds. So removing the little bit of polishing that I have on this, this is what the gritty sounds like. Again, very similar to the original sound that we have. Then we have an EQ here that's doing two things. It's cutting some of the pesky low mids out that can interfere with the drums, the kick and the snare transients a lot. Then we have this snap heap, and this is super important. And what this does is takes this sound that's all stereo width and gates it. So as you can see here, I'll go into my snap heap for a second. I have an audio follower that what that is doing is as the gain goes up, it's building an envelope based off of that. I turn the attack all the way down and the release down a little bit. And then I also have that running into an upper limit. So what this upper limit does is when that peak gets hit, it clips it down and keeps it at the 50% so that with my width, with this upper limit now routed to my width, as you can see, as the volume increases on my vector scope here, the width increases and decreases. So we'll turn this off. And the reason for that was in the final result for this track, when everything was turned on in the mix, everything was so stereo wide that it was losing a lot of punch. So then I have a compressor just kind of ducking the tails down a little bit. It's not doing too much at all. So then I'll go in and show that the reason for this notch that I have here is if we turn our bright on, I'm gonna have to get rid of everything real quick. Bring my mixer back up. Bring this back up. And then if I turn my bright on, I have the secondary analyzer source set to bright. And as you can see, super harsh peaks right here that I wanted to give space for. Then again here, turn this back on. It's just letting the gritty sound and the bright sound both have their own resonant parts that don't interfere too much. Like if I turn this back off, hear how much less space there is for the bright to happen. Yeah, I think I'm kind of over explaining this, but you get the point there. Nothing insane going on, just making space, mixing and such. And then I have, oh, that's my airy synth. So then I have my bright here, which, oh, I've had my reverb off the whole time. That's no good. It doesn't matter too much, but in the final, I think in the beginning result, I do have the reverb on. Maybe not though. So again, just cutting the low end out of this a little bit and then clipping it. Yeah. It's not too much change there. Really just didn't have to do too much polishing to that because it was already, I think, a good sound. It fit so well on its own that I didn't have to blend it with the other sounds too much. I just had to accentuate it by removing other sounds. So then we have our airy layer that I've gone in here and boosted those low mids that I was cutting in the other sounds. And let's play this all in context and hear what that does. It's almost non-existent, right? As you can see there, if I turn on my mastering chain and all that, and I don't have that low mid boost, this airy sound takes up so little space that it almost dissolves into the mix. So by boosting these low mids, what else is being accounted for here? I think the gritty. Yep, and so I'm boosting the low mids, and I'm also cutting a notch for my gritty resonance right here to fit in. Then I go in and clip this, the airy sound. And so I'm boosting the gain here and cutting down the ceiling, which turns it from... Let me see. Yeah, as you can see, it's just pushing the gain a certain amount. Like if you look at the shape of it, if you look at our peaks right here, they're just going up, kind of hitting negative 6 dB, but not being really loud at that point. And then the clipper is letting it, you know, go up and hit that 6 dB. It's probably in reality, it's just boosting it. It's boosting it a significant amount. I'm kind of getting caught up on the mix here because that is, you know, a significant part of this track, but it's just boosting it, not distorting it too much. So then with our sub here, I used a technique that I think is definitely worth knowing, and that is I added a little MIDI out sidechain that gates noise on the sub. And if we play it in context, like if I remove that piece from the track, it adds, I would say, a significant amount of aggressiveness to the final product. With the gritty patch brings a lot of that, but also with the noise gate, it's just filling it out more, making it a big full sounding thing. So we'll solo out my sub, add this in, and the way that I accomplished this was I have a destructor that on its own, I have to leave this on. The destructor comes in here and adds a noise layer to the top. The way that this works is once this gate threshold gets passed, there's a noise layer that's added. I have a noise bandpass turned on that just, you know, puts a bandpass filter on the noise. It's I can't turn many parts of this off or it will completely won't work. So I'll just keep moving and show you. So as you can see here, the preamp pushes it to the gate threshold. Once the gate threshold is passed, noise comes in, right? No noise, more noise, even more noise, less noise. So as you can see, it's pushed right up to that gate threshold. Then my next thing here, and this is what this MIDI out is controlling. Let me go into here. I have this little short noise chain note that goes this far, but I cut it off in the playlist. And I did that so that I could have it turn on and off at different rates if I wanted to, but I ended up just leaving it all at that one rate, that one length. I don't know if anybody already knew this. An old FL, I think an old version of FL used to be, if you had notes that ran past the end of your little audio of your playlist clip, it would play the full note out. But now if you shorten it, you can have different lengths of note just by changing the length of the clip in the playlist. So that's the method to that madness. So then we have here that MIDI out clip that I just showed right here, noise chain, is set to 12, which goes into the input port here, right? I went into my settings tab, put the MIDI input port at 12. So I have a note gate set to where anytime that MIDI input is pressed, it sends that trigger into the into the trigger input of this envelope here, right? And it's holding it for the length of that, but it doesn't really matter because this triggers once the threshold's passed. And then I have seamless mode on here. I don't know if it took me a little while to figure this out, but you can right click the trigger and you have some settings here. The threshold is when is the attack going to be triggered. The note trigger set to auto, which I haven't changed this or experimented too much with it, but you can read that and figure out what those do. Then seamless is important for this, which just means when it's on, if the envelope is like maybe right here in the curve, it doesn't start back at 0 and go all the way up. It starts back at wherever it's at in the curve. And you hear that it introduces a little bit of clickiness there, and gives it a way different attack. So we'll turn that back on. And I just felt like that sounded quite a bit better. So then I have a little bit of attack on here, and this is only routed to two things, and that is a gain here, right? So we have this separated. So it's turning our gain from 0% all the way up to 200%. And then we have filter, a filter with a boost that's being modulated. If I turn that off, it's just kind of adding a little bit of a filter sweep to it. Some gain modulation. Then we have a pretty heavy compressor. Turn that back off. Let me use this. She's just bringing the gain up a lot on that. Then a low shelf bringing the gain down, and then another gain increase here. So a lot of gain staging. This is a pretty technical little thing here. You have to know a good bit about production to do this, I would say. But you know, it's useful to know, and it's definitely a way to get into stuff like this. So then we have, for the low end, I will say, I just added this filter to cut the noise out, right? That noise that gets introduced there, I use this low pass to remove that. All right, I'm sorry, that's quite a bit to kind of try and delve through real quick, but that's what we got. And I'm gonna go into my EQ here. So I'm boosting the highs. And then we just have a compressor, just kind of trying to glue it back together a little bit once that noise gets introduced. And from there, we can go ahead and I'll just show really quick the effects that I have on this little memory conduit sample. And so I used a stereo shaper to bring it in a little bit, because as you can see, it's pretty heavily panned stuff. Like if I show you the sample, there's just such a Haas delay on this that it's kind of all happening at different. I used granular synthesis to make that, I think. So there's a lot of left-right differences in the stereo field. Then we have a boost here, boosting the highs. I could have left that higher, but you know, it is what it is on that. And then this compressor is doing nothing here, but I think it does something maybe at this section. It might just be legacy though. Sometimes, it just barely does anything. Sometimes that happens. Oh, maybe this is the piece where it does it, because I also have this routed to it. Yeah, so it's bringing this peak down like a little bit. It's not that important. And this is what's really controlling the peak, is we have a clipper with a pretty hard knee right there. You know, this little curve is pretty sharp, almost at a hard clip point. Clipping that in, clipping that in. The laser effect is routed to its own section. I'll go ahead and show on the gritty hit on this section. We have the stereo width modulation that raises. And so it kind of goes up into that mono laser hit. Then it's being OTT'd and filtered. Right, given space for that sub to do what it's doing, which is, of course, rise up in pitch really quickly. As you can see, that's a cutting space for that sub down there. And let me see if there's anything else mixing wise that I need to show, and no, that's going to be it. Okay, and with that, finally we've come to the mastering. And so I'm going to go through my mastering chain really quickly here. We have an OTT. That what this is doing here, I've brought all three of these bands to the highest percentage, so 200% on all these, reduce the depth and drop the output gain. And what that does is just glue all the sounds together. And if I remove this, as you can see, it's making it a little louder, a little bit more energetic, and it's also gluing stuff together, I would say. So then I have a Pro Q3 that works in tandem with my two clippers here. So I have, I'll explain the clippers first, and then we'll do the OTT, because it's kind of like a two-step process, with this one being easier to explain, I would say. So I have my first clipper is a heavy, it is a pretty heavy clipping job. I've set my ceiling to -4, so the point that it clips is at -4. I turned oversampling on, which means I'm not going to get that sharp completely sausaged out peak, you know, the completely slammed down dynamics on the top of this. And then I've also just pushed the input, and what that's doing, this one's adding like a distortion type glue to the mix, and my second one is going to act as my limiting clipper. So as you can see there, this one's giving that more sharp top that I have on it. So now showing my EQ, pretty simple. If I turn these bands off, it doesn't feel bright and heavy enough to me. It almost, you know, it's too spacious in ways too. So I've boosted my highs a significant amount. I've boosted the mid highs. I've done a high cut, which as you can see just adds a nice little sharpness to that. And then here, I've cut the mids down, which, like, to me, this really sounds a little bit too mid-heavy and not sharp and aggressive enough without that. It's almost the same principle as, like, instead of boosting the highs more, you can cut the lows and push it into a clipper with more gain, right? Cut the lows, push more gain into it, and it gets way sharper. But in this case, I liked where my lows were sitting, and I felt like the mids were being the pesky. Right, I like the level they're at with it on. And to me, it just, I feel like I don't know what to really say about this other than this cut makes sense to my ears. And yeah. And with that, that's going to really do it for this one, y'all. I know this has been quite a probably lengthy tutorial. The recording has been over 2 hours, so we'll see how short I can get this one. But and then yeah, thanks for watching. I hope y'all picked up some tricks you can use. If you have any questions, put those in the comments. Any just general comments or roasting that you want to do, put that in the comments. And thank you to everybody who replied to the little poll that I put up saying, you know, what genres do you want to see? Because that is the reason that I went for Tearout in this one, because that I was surprised. I thought it was going to be mostly Dariacore because those videos get more views. I'm just glad we got some Tearout people, and I will see you in the next one.